Hello, Jerry here. Welcome back to the Old Testament prophets. Last week we considered how the Jews who had returned from Babylon had, over time, lost their divine mission to rebuild that temple. There had been opposition, but then they just set aside the project until some future propitious time. Not in one conscious, malicious decision, but over time, that project just faded away, and in its place they were working on their own homes. And what was the first way God tried to get their attention? Yes, circumstances. A systemic failure. Crops, business, home, society. Nothing was working. But they didn't seek God about this. And what was the second way God reached out to them? The prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. Their preaching reawakened the Jews and restored their spiritual perspective. And God got close to them again and revitalized their spirits, so they were excited to get back on mission and build that temple. They had been walking in disobedience, but we would characterize this as more of a careless disobedience. Haggai kept charging them, "Take careful thought to your ways." But as soon as they began to be obedient and on mission again, God started blessing them again. We ended class generalizing how easily we can fall into stepping out of obedience and faith, becoming more interested in our own things. We read last week from Paul, Ephesians 5, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." And we had good class discussion on this. So let's get back to the text of Ezra, chapters 5 and 6. These two chapters mostly comprise two letters, one written by the Persian governor of the region that included Judah and Jerusalem. His name was Tattenai, and the answer to that letter by King Darius. And this is such a long passage, I played a YouTube 7-minute dramatic reading of chapters 5 and 6, rather than me turning a bunch of PowerPoint slides with the scriptures on them. But if you're listening online, you'll have to just read chapters 5 and 6, which I recommend you do right now before you continue, as we're going to have discussion on this. So we can see in these chapters that Tattenai, the governor, whom we know of from a Persian inscription of this time, was a much more objective and fair politician than that last group of leaders we read, I believe, last week, who wrote a lot of slander and accusations against the Jews. Tattenai probably did not want the Jews to be building. He seemed suspicious of their activity. But in all fairness, he asked King Darius that a search be made in the government archives for that decree of Cyrus that the Jews claimed Cyrus made. Tattenai was probably not expecting they would find it, but they did. And King Darius was totally in sympathy with that decree, commanding Tattenai not to hinder the Jews and to fully support them from the treasury. My, the Lord works in interesting ways, doesn't he? So as the Jews were stepping back into his program for building the temple, the Lord brought Darius to power and allowed them to find that decree over in the library at the city of Ecbatana, east of Babylon, a little northeast, where the kings lived in those hot summer months, and from where Cyrus had originally posted that decree. Everything came together so that the Jews finished the temple in February-March in 516 B.C. Or it could have been 515. Some scholars believe that. Well, hallelujah. They had started it about 21 years earlier. And then they celebrated the Passover feast there, that feast that pictured the Hebrews being delivered out of Egyptian slavery. The Exodus was the real beginning of the nation and the covenant with God, and then the tabernacle, and then the promised land and the temple. All that began with the Exodus. And once again, now in 516, almost 1,000 years after the Exodus, the people worshipped the Lord as the one who had brought them up out of slavery in Egypt to be his people. And while the Passover feast is one day, it is followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread that lasted for 7 days. So, an 8-day event. The Feast of Unleavened Bread commemorated the Jews' hasty exit from Egypt, not even having time to wait for the bread to rise from leaven. So think of the immersion they enjoyed in this 8-day Passover unleavened bread feasts. We have to imagine it because in our mainstream American culture, we don't have any lengthy holidays like that within our wider culture. Ours are one day, unless you count Christmas Eve and Christmas. The Jews had 8 days to see and smell the offerings, to sing, to hear prayers, to hear singing and teaching about the Passover and the Exodus. There was that immersion, like an 8-day spiritual retreat. All this happened within the temple. God made the temple central for Jewish feasts, and it was central to all Old Testament Judaism, which is why the destruction of that temple by Babylon was such a catastrophe. Now, let me illustrate the importance of the temple, and also speak to the event of that 70-year captivity. Many Christians wonder about when that 70 years began and when it ended. The options open to us for the beginning of the captivity are 605 BC, when the first captives began to be taken with that first deportation. Or should we commence the 70 years in 586 BC, when the captivity of the Jews was completed with the third deportation? There's our two options. So let's run with this, starting first with the 605 date and the first deportation of captives. So counting 70 years inclusively, or including the year 605, this puts us in 536. However, the decree of Cyrus freeing the Jews was in 538 BC, and their travel and arrival was in 538 and 537, not 536, which has led some commentators to say the Lord was giving a round number, 70 being a rounded 67 or 68. However, we've learned about something that did happen in 536, the beginning of the work on the temple. Ezra 3:8 said, "Now in the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel and Jeshua made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and up to supervise the work of the house of the Lord." Now, the MacArthur Study Bible on this verse notes, quote, approximately April-May 536. And then MacArthur writes, this officially ended the 70 years captivity that began in 605 BC, end quote. So the captivity of the Jews could have ended when they began work on the temple in 536, which is very interesting because that would mean that the captivity in God's eyes did not end when Cyrus published that decree, nor when their tired Jewish feet crossed into the city limits of Jerusalem or Judah, nor when they started living in their rebuilt homes, but rather at the time when they began to rebuild the temple. Again, our point, the centrality of the Temple of Jerusalem in God's program, the place of God's presence among them. Okay, now let's consider a second date for the 70-year captivity commencing not in 605, but in 586 BC, when the captives were then completely collected in that final and largest deportation. Now that places the end of the 70 years right when the temple was completed, which we saw today in either 515 or early 516. So isn't it interesting that we actually have two 70-year periods at the front and back ends of the deportations of the Jews to Babylon? That is, 70 years from the first deportation to the beginning of the temple, and 70 years from the last deportation and the finishing of the temple. But to our point, both pointed to the priority of that temple, when work on it began and when the work was finally finished. Again, the ending of the captivity apparently wasn't when the decree was made or when they arrived in the land or when their own houses were built. It was all about God's house, his temple. Okay, now one more interesting tidbit. There is a very interesting passage in 2 Chronicles 36. He took into exile, that is, the Lord took into exile in Babylon, those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. The Lord in Leviticus had commanded very clearly. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord." So God's people had set aside this command from God for 490 years. That is, 70 years times 7 for the single year every 7 years. 70 times 7, that equals 490, which takes us back to the time of Eli, the high priest, and then King Saul in the opening chapters of 1 Samuel. So, in addition to the 70 years being the perfect amount of time for the discipline of God's people in Babylon, the 70 years were also making up for those Sabbath years missed on the land. This time during the captivity was fulfilling God's holy requirements on the land. When they returned after 70 years, God wanted to bless his people with no outstanding spiritual debt, so to speak, on the land. Well, next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the other prophet that God raised up in this time, Zechariah. Thanks very much.